Hi, so many of you have asked, and I wanted to make a video today to talk about the ways in which I was able to circumvent, navigate, and ultimately overcome challenges I faced during my career in biomedical research and academia that many would consider to be insurmountable, but simply because they may not know exactly how best to go about pivoting, reorienting, and pushing through. So, First, before I start, I want to say that these situations, which seem unconventional and seem like maybe you're the only one going through them, I think they're more common than people think. And I think through a combination of survivorship bias and stigma, it's not obvious how many other people may be going through this sort of thing. And I say survivorship bias in that a lot of the people that face these challenges ultimately are not able to progress in academia through no fault of their own. I mean, really, that's a failure of a lot of other systems that I'm not going to get into in this video. But many people do. And then in comes the stigma. So the people that do overcome these obstacles often don't discuss them because they're worried about the associated shame, and they're essentially concerned with the stigma. And that is not a naive concern, it's very real. I even struggled internally, like, do I mention the things I've been through in applications for fellowships and things like that? And ultimately I did, but I toned it down and watered it down a lot. And I almost didn't put it at all. So in case you're like, what the fuck are you even talking about? I'm currently a postdoc in bioengineering. I work in immune engineering. I did a bachelor's in biomedical engineering that took 5 years because it was derailed by psychotic breaks and a bipolar 1 diagnosis. I then did a master's, and then I did a PhD. And my PhD, I started homeless due to a relationship I shouldn't have been in, that I was in throughout my master's, and then left it and became essentially homeless. So I started my PhD homeless. I also had to escape a cult, which is a whole other thing, during my PhD. And all of these things compounded, but I found ways to navigate them. And a lot of people may not have the guidance to navigate similar things. And so I'm going to talk a little about it. And the first thing I'm going to talk about, and this is unstructured, I don't intend to edit it because I don't, I don't want to, honestly. So if it gets very tangential and I'm just, then just bear with me. I think the biggest thing during my bachelor's, other than grit, and I talk about in my study tips for neurodivergent folks video that's on this YouTube, I also talk about reframing your neurodivergence as like a superpower, like the fact that you overcompensate is a superpower, but that's not really what I'm talking about, the ADHD. I'm more talking about the bipolar. So long story short, I had multiple suicide attempts during undergrad, which culminated into a manic break, a psychotic break due to mania, the onset of mania, that led to a bipolar diagnosis, but only after the suicide attempts and the psychotic break, which derailed my entire life. And also, in the process of developing a appropriate regimen of drugs to bring me down from the mania, I was at one point prescribed triliptal, which is a seizure medication often used for the management of bipolar. That gave me Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a very rare condition in which the mucous membranes disintegrate and essentially your skin falls off, and it has a 10% mortality rate. That being said, I was out. I was out for the count, deep it down, for multiple months in what was supposed to be my senior year of my biomedical engineering bachelor's, and obviously that's not the year that I finished. I took an additional year. The two, I don't know, they really could be classified as two things I did that saved me and allowed me to continue is one, documentation. Like, so even if you don't have the ability to have established care with a psychiatrist, at the very least, if you are let's say 5150, which is what happened to me. Like, for those that don't know, when a person is a danger to themselves, they are not arrested per se, but they're detained and then they're taken involuntarily to a psychiatric treatment center and treated against their will. Or I should say, whether they consent to treatment or not. It's not your choice. So even if you don't have a documented, established care with a psychiatrist that can write you a letter, which mine did, you still have that documentation. And so if you can get a letter, great. If you can't, you have a documentation of health concerns. And this is not just for psychiatric health concerns, but any sort of health concerns, because all health concerns certainly have the tendency to derail your academic performance. And because of that, the other thing I was able to do was I went and I was lucky in a way that the people working in the department were kind, some of them, and sought to understand what I was going through and help me, some of them. But the one that did went to bat for me in terms of retroactively triggering, however you say, that medical leave. So I was not absent and failing and not around and blah, blah, blah. I was on medical leave. And she pulled a few strings to do that. And all that just to say that go out on a limb and see if someone will help you out. Like, I owe a lot of the chance of the ability to continue my career to the grace of administrators within the department. It's worth a shot. If it's either you leave without a degree or you ask someone, hey, please help me out, ask them to help you out. You would be surprised how willing people often are to do that. So those are the two things. And also, I should mention, if you don't have access to a psychiatrist, any large public, and I'm assuming private, though I wasn't at a private university institution, should have a health center. At the very least, they should have the ability, even if they don't have a psychiatrist, they should have some sort of psych NPs or some sort of healthcare professional that is at least able to document that you are in crisis. And so that is important. That documentation is important. And I obviously didn't have the cognitive ability to pursue that in the moment, but afterwards I was able to cobble together all these documents and say, hey, I was going through a medical emergency that incapacitated me, and I want to finish the degree. So another thing that is complicated that wasn't for me but maybe for you, and I want to just, though I have no advice because I didn't go through it, I just want to acknowledge that is the reality, is that the funding for my undergrad was on scholarship. So I was ultimately able to continue and to finish. There were some strings pulled for me there, and I look back at the pattern of people who went out on a limb for me because they believed that I had more to offer intellectually than they felt the burden was heavy of the administrative strings that they may have to pull or the paperwork they had to figure out due to some of the moments in my life that weren't maybe the proudest ones. All that being said, when I look back at everything, the only thing I wish I had done differently is been a little bit nicer to myself. You can imagine that 5th year when everyone around me who I started coded into, because you have to compete to enter. When you get in the school, then you have to get into the engineering department, and biomedical engineering is the most competitive. So everyone, that's called codaing when you get in. So everyone I entered university with, coded with, and went through all these classes with is graduating. They're starting grad school, they're at biotech companies, they're in medical school, and I'm here with the kids that were the juniors while I'm the seniors, scrambling to rebuild my life and figure out the right balance of psychiatric meds, doing my 5th year of undergraduate. And at the time, that felt like the end of the world. It felt demoralizing. It felt humiliating. But looking back now, I'm really proud, because I think a lot of people would have just quit. So then we move on to my master's. And so a question I get a lot too is, throughout all of that, obviously my grades were not the best. So I finished my bachelor's with a 3.1 GPA, which I think anyone who is interested enough to watch this knows that it's not competitive for grad school. So how did I even end up doing the PhD, getting into the program, much less finishing it or whatever? I worked at Outback for a couple years. I had no other options. That obviously was quite demoralizing at the time. But I was trying to apply to master's, or no, actually really wasn't. I'd pretty much given up on my childhood dream of being a scientist. But there was a professor near the end of biomed who was a polymer scientist that taught a biomaterials course, who was kind to me. So at some point, I don't remember, it's been a long time, I asked him to sit down with me, and he did. And he recommended I try this master's in textile engineering. And the project, right, was a biomedical engineering project. It was a hernia mesh project. But because the department was considered a little less prestigious than the engineering department, it was a little easier maybe to get in. So I applied, I took the GRE, I wrote a really compelling personal statement, and I got in. And I did a really good job during my master's. Despite other struggles I had, like fucked up relationship during, I did quite well during my master's because I really thrived doing research in ways that I didn't thrive book learning necessarily. And that made me competitive for the PhD. And actually, my advisor for my master's recommended me to, he was on the committee of my PhD advisor when she was doing her either master's or PhD, I forget. And she did her PhD at UCLA, then she worked at a company, then she worked at a museum, and then she also had done a postdoc at UC Davis at some point, blah, blah, blah. And she's coming back to the university I graduated from. And he recommended me. And she took a chance on a student that maybe wasn't that great on paper. And I took a chance because joining the lab of the first student of a non-established PI it's a risk, and it ultimately paid off for both of us. That's when I did some of the research you probably saw on Instagram, the induced pluripotent stem cell derived cardiomyocyte research. Can't speak highly enough about her. I can't speak highly enough about all these people involved. You see, one of the recurrent themes here is something that I had to teach myself to do because it did not come naturally for me, which is just asking for help or advice. That is what opened so many doors for me. And then I am going to pause because my girlfriend's calling me. And when I come back, I'll talk a little bit about navigating the homelessness and the... I'm not going to talk about the cult. It's its own thing. But I'm going to talk about navigating the homelessness and some resources for that when I come back. I will mention before I go, that thing of doing a master's post-bac before getting into what I ultimately wanted to do is very common. So the lab manager that later joined that lab, my PhD lab, he was working in between stuff, trying to figure it out because he didn't get into medical school the first time he applied right after his bachelor's. He did a master's in physiology at that school while he was our lab manager, and then he got into Duke, which I'm sure you know is like one of the best medical schools in the world. So that's common. Like, don't count yourself out the way I did mentally straight out of my bachelor's. Like, it's all over for me because my GPA is tanked and I don't look that good on paper. A good master's or a good post-bac program can totally change the game for you. And I look back and it's terrifying how close I came to just being like, I'm just gonna not pursue my dream of being a scientist. Because I thought there was nothing else for me. There's always a way. There's always a way. I'm gonna go answer my girlfriend her FaceTime real quick. Okay, I'm back. So then what am I talking about? All right, so grad school. Like I said, I started my PhD homeless, and I wasn't homeless like on the streets, but I was living in my car with brief periods of couch surfing for, I want to say it was almost 2 months. I could be wrong, but I think it was about 2 months. And the it's difficult to say in any other way than you have to have the mental fortitude, the grit, and the stubbornness to push through. And to be clear, I don't think this isn't like an American dream video of we should all suffer and suffering is holy and you'll be rewarded for licking the boot of capitalism. No, I don't believe that. But I do believe my internal motivation pushed me to force myself to show up and complete what I needed to complete despite being essentially unhoused at the time. And that's why I sometimes recommend when people ask me in my comments, should I do a PhD? I never want to tell someone not to do a PhD. It's one of the greatest and worst experiences one can have. It's unparalleled. And the intellectual freedom, the intellectual training, the ability to pursue science, it's amazing. But if you, I hear this sometimes from doctors, like and surgeons especially, like if you can see yourself doing anything else, maybe go do that. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say if you know that your journey is going to be rocky and you don't want to be doing it, I think had I not been dead set, I wouldn't have had the tenacity to push through. Like imagine sleeping in your car, getting up, going to classes. There was a point where I was going to have to sell my laptop for food and ultimately didn't. And what pushed me through is that I could not see myself doing anything else with my life and being fulfilled. And I think, funny enough, that the fact that I had given up on the dream after I'd crashed out during my bachelor's, and then it's like it was so out of my reach and then it was right there, that pushed me. Like I'm not letting go of this, like over my dead body. I remember writing that in a journal. I know that's not healthy, but it's where I was at mentally. It's how I had to push myself to do what I needed to do. And it was this thing where it's like, this is what I wanted all my life, to be a scientist. I get into my bachelor's, it's in the field I want to do. I fail so badly, but I dig myself out, and now I'm here in this way that I never thought I'd even have the chance to even get a shot to try to get here. And so even though I was sleeping in my car and starving, something in me would not let myself let go of this dream that I thought I couldn't have. And then now it turns out that maybe I can. I just wasn't letting that go. I say all that to say that fortitude, that feeling that deep in my soul there was nothing else for me, pushed me. And I'm not saying you have to have that. I'm not saying like, oh, I'm so great for pushing through, but I'm saying there has to be something. If you're gonna go through it and stay on course for your PhD, the only way to do that without going completely insane is if you love it. And that's why I did this PhD, because I love it. That being said, some more tangible things, material things. Your university should have a food bank. Every university I've been at has had a food bank. If not your food bank, then there are usually mutual aid hubs, things like Food Not Bombs. Even I was later involved in food and meal distro. So take advantage of it. Let go of your pride or whatever classist indoctrination makes you think that it's a bad thing. Let go of this idea like some people have it worse than me, so maybe I shouldn't take up these resources. Like if you're doing bad enough that you have to consider needing them, then you're doing bad enough to take advantage of them. And food banks really helped me out during my PhD, those starting years. There are sometimes emergency funds. Now, I don't know if these still exist, but I do know that this coincided with COVID. So there was a lot of emergency funding allocated for students who had financial issues due to COVID. So I applied to some of those. I actually didn't get a lot of them. I think the lady who worked in the office didn't like me, or maybe she just didn't like her job or her life or something. I don't know, but she never approved my shit, even when I really needed it. So for me, that didn't work. But I think that if those things are available, resources, you should take advantage of them and apply. Also, there will be at large universities, probably all schools, someone called an ombudsman. This is someone who's supposed to be an impartial, non-administrative, someone who ideally and is supposed to be not in university politics. The whole point of an ombudsman is objectivity, and also you can set up a meeting with them and they're supposed to help you. They're supposed to let you know what resources are available to you as a student. So eventually I was able to stabilize on my stipend and get housing, and there was other stuff that was going on. I had a felony record for the toppling of a Confederate statue in Durham, allegedly, and though the charges were dropped by Durham, even when I had saved up the money, I had a criminal record. I had to go to the courthouse and prove that the charges were dropped, and ultimately got housed, and that was what it was. For the rest of my PhD, I was fine. I was housed. But I did rely on the food bank. I also had friends that I stayed on their couches, and I developed friendships with my lab mates, and that served me extremely well moving forward. And I really can't stress enough how many resources there are at universities. Like, the other thing is I didn't have to buy pads and tampons because most universities now have free pads and tampons in some of the bathrooms and some of the campuses. So I would go find those places and just take a bunch. They're free. I'm not gonna lie, like, I hope that this is not gonna get me in trouble. I don't fucking know. Get me arrested. I stole toilet paper from the university. Like, I had to do that. And I took advantage of clubs. Like, almost all, if you're on a college campus, there's a lot of student organizations, there's a lot of clubs, there's a lot of interest meetings, there's a lot of seminars, and they almost always have free food. So go take the free food, eat the free food, and at the end they're almost like, oh no, we have too much food, like, can someone take them the food? Take the food, eat the food. And there's like a way more free stuff on campuses than you would think. There's also showers in the gyms. So any large university will have a gym. Some of them have multiple gyms that you as a student with your student ID can swipe in and use the shower there if you need to shower. They also have what am I saying? I just thought of it and it escaped me. They also have their library will have computers. So I mentioned that I was at some point thought I was going to have to sell my laptop for food money or life living expenses. I ultimately didn't, but if I had, even though it would have been inconvenient, it would have been fine. I could have used university computers. Most universities also lend out computers. So if you are a student and you have an ID, you can rent computers. Sometimes it's like a day, sometimes it's like a week. And side note, they have all sorts of stuff like cameras, fancy cameras, and podcasting equipment and random stuff. Like my university even had these random like emotional support animals that were robots. They had all sorts of stuff. And I really cannot stress enough to find out what resources are available to you for free through your university. Also, I mentioned the Student Health Center when I was talking about the stuff that happened during my bachelor's. That is free for students. And so there was a counseling center at my university, as there should be at yours. And I saw a psychiatrist. He was a psychiatrist, and I saw him for free. None of this is free because there's student fees, but if you're in a PhD that's funded, your tuition is paid through your tuition, through your funding. So take advantage of all of those things. There's just way more free stuff at universities than you would think. That and just the mental, emotional grit I discussed earlier, I ultimately was able to push through. So, hope that was even a little bit helpful. I know it was rambly. I'm not gonna edit this. I told you I didn't want to. I don't want to do that. I just don't want to. But hopefully, like some of these other videos, it is at least a little helpful. I really, really want to stress to take advantage of the resources of the university. If you are experiencing instability, food wise, housing wise, or whatever, mentally as well, there should be a counseling center at your university. So that's it for now. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if there's something you want me to address in other videos. And yeah, that's all. Bye.